Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This podcast is about the place where design and development overlap. We talk with experts to get their point of view about trends in design, code, and how it relates to the world around us. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or generally tell us what you think, go ahead and tweet us at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you. We are in a crazy time in this country with coronavirus, with a lot of unrest going on right now, and things are a little bit wild still. So bear with us on this recording. We want to try to be sensitive to what's going on right now. And so we're going to release this when it's appropriate, but I just want to acknowledge that things are a little crazy, and I hope everybody's doing okay out there. Today, we're with Jina Anne. She's been doing design systems for over 15 years at companies like Salesforce, Apple, and Amazon. She's been very focused recently on the design systems community and building up just an incredible group of people that are super supportive of each other, supportive of design systems inside of enterprise and all over the world. Really happy to have you on today, Jina. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So just kind of diving right into it, you've spent a lot of time breaking ground, for lack of a better word, in this community and in this space, working at big organizations like Salesforce and Amazon, like two pioneering groups in the design system space, both creators of really interesting design token systems like Theo and Style Dictionary and those sorts of things. What was that like to be kind of an early pioneer in this space, and what were the things that were going through your head when you were sort of fashioning the early foundations of a lot of this work?
Thanks for asking. To be honest, at that time, I didn't really see anything as being pioneering. You're just kind of in the moment. But I was part of the inception of Theo, as well as, the concept of design tokens. And really, it just came down to a necessity that we needed, and it just made sense. At Salesforce, we had to scale across not just, a web-based product, but we had to scale across multiple code bases. Some companies and acquisitions that we were dealing with were on Java, some were on PHP, some were on Ruby, some were on, .NET. They were all over the place. And of course, React, Angular, and of course, there's native platforms as well. And so we had to come up with something that would allow us to scale across all these things. So it just seemed to make sense. And it was a very, even the phrase design tokens was a very Salesforce-centric thing based on the technology that we had. I didn't think that the whole community would start putting design tokens in their own design systems. So that was pretty cool to see. But at the time, it was just doing what we needed to do to get things done.
No, I think that's how any great broader concept starts, right? Is you get this idea of, how am I experiencing this acute pain, right? Like, I have all these different technology stacks. I have all these different systems, all these different applications that I need something to unify. So how do I solve that problem in a really practical sense that has to not just go deep into one app, but wide across a whole bunch of them?
Yeah, exactly.
So I am curious, who came up with the name design tokens? Because I think that this is something that I like occasionally chuckle at a little bit in the back of my mind when I'm explaining what design tokens are to somebody that is new to the design systems world. And they're always say, why do people call them that? Why did you guys call them that? I am really curious about this.
So let me give you the backstory. Because it is really funny to read some of the commentary. By the way, that's my cat in the background. She wants me to pick her up. But yeah, so if you've ever had to localize content for your application, you will often wrap your content in what is known as a token. It's like a string that you pass data through. And then that way you can just swap out, English with Japanese or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. So it's that same kind of, that same concept. Salesforce at the time was using the precursor to what is now known as the Lightning platform. It was called Aura. And they weren't using anything like SAS or LESS or Stylus, so they had basically built their own way of processing CSS in their component platform, and it was using token strings basically. And so they would pass in, using XML data, different CSS values, and they were doing sort of, in a way, it was almost like you take like some of the concepts of SaaS and some of the concepts of web components, but in the very Salesforce way of doing it. Here, I'm going to pick up my cat so she stops meowing.
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
Yeah, she's 18, so she's been a little needy and crabby lately. But yeah, so that was the technology that we were using. They called them tokens, and it's the same concept in localization, like I said. So we called them design tokens because we were basically passing our design language through the same concept, the same tech. We didn't have SaaS being in use on the product side, but we were using it on the design team because we needed to prototype. And of course, there was our style guide website. And so we, on the design team, were using SaaS. So it kind of worked out because then we could create a system that would give us the SaaS variables we needed, but also work for the platform that they use, which is why if you use Theo, which was the open source design tokens kind of like distribution tool that we had created, you'll see that there's a Lightning format in there, and some people might be like, what the heck is this?
Gotcha.
It was the Salesforce centric thing. And then we also had some teams using Stylus, some teams using less, of course, Android, iOS, and so on. And so
so all that transformation was kind of like the baking for this whole system of how you basically share rules that come from design.
Yeah, and we kind of just accidentally discovered a really great way to have, to use the cliche, single source of truth. But before, like if, let's say there was a color we were using for text and it didn't contrast high enough against a background color, it used to take us a long time to like notify the Android devs and notify the iOS devs and notify the Aura devs and like all the other product teams, where now, because we had built that infrastructure in place, like we just make the change and then they would get that change in the next time that they do a build. And then we didn't even really think about it at the time, but we realized it also opened up so many possibilities for theming and customization and branding and like all that stuff. So we kind of just realized like this is it. This is what we're doing. And I will say, this is pre-Lightning design system, but because we had set this all up, it made when we were ready to build out the Lightning design system so much easier because that infrastructure was in place.
Yeah, and it's honestly the foundational infrastructure for a lot of the value of design systems. I kind of find when we're talking to customers about how to implement design systems in that kind of crawl, walk, run sort of approach, the crawl is kind of recognizing that you have a need for a design system and getting that all spun up and all that sort of thing. But like when we talk about walking, like the first thing that we always talk about is how you get design tokens up and running, because the cross-platform nature of it is really powerful, especially as it relates to adoption. Getting it so that every Android team, an iOS team, an app team that is a web app, like all using the same set of values, regardless of what sort of templating language you're using or what sort of platform you're on. Like that is a truly like pervasively adoptable system. And I think that that's kind of the brilliance of defining these kind of basic bits and these pairs of values that dictate the rules for how the system should be interpreted. When you think about kind of some of those early decisions around Theo and around design tokens and around Lightning, when you had to deal with all these different cross-platform apps and all of these kind of different environments, how did you create some sort of systematic approach to that? Because when I think about this, like I look at this really daunting task of I'm going to go create Lightning, right? And I'm going to go create Lightning, and it's going to go support not just a community of apps inside of Salesforce, but a community of applications within a partner ecosystem, within a consumer ecosystem. Like the scope of it, the scope of the problem space is really grand. And I'm sure that like this wasn't all tackled at once, but like what was the systematic approach you took for that? And like, is what Lightning became really the execution of a vision, or did that kind of evolve along the way too?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that helped us, which, this is back in I think 2014 was when I switched from a different product at Salesforce to joining the core team. I had never heard of any company having a dedicated design systems team before, but Salesforce had decided that that's what we needed. And so I think just the fact that that decision was made was a huge catalyst for it, because that was our gig. That was our time, spent was working on this stuff. So there was an initiative called Salesforce One, which was basically when they decided to unify all their different, features and experiences under one app. And it was a mobile app called Salesforce One. And they modernized the design. And I think they don't actually like when we say modernize, but that's the reality of what we were doing, because the classic UI wasn't really suited for mobile. So we had to kind of modernize things. So that was like a redesign effort. And redesigns, I think, are always going to help like kind of push, these type of movements forward. So we already had a style guide in place for that, and it was beautiful. It's actually what really drew me to join this team and to become a part of it.
It's actually really incredible when you think about what that style guide really represents, right? Because when we think about the notion of consumerization of enterprise, right? Like you think about how the iPhone existed and like some of the more modern Android devices existed. Now, all of a sudden, everybody's enterprise app had a new standard that it had to meet, which was what every single consumer carried around in their pocket. Like that app experience, that all of a sudden, like the old like classic UI of Salesforce was no longer going to cut it in terms of what consumers were really demanding in terms of these new UIs. And I think it's kind of the poster child for successfully making that leap into a place where you had this old enterprise app that was basically like a bunch of tables and forms and buttons that now is all of a sudden like this much richer experience.
Yeah, so that, was pretty successful. And then we realized, okay, now we need to do this for the desktop UI. And that was treated as a new initiative, not really as an add-on to the previous one. And the code name at the time we were calling it was Solaris. And it was basically this idea that everything would look very modern and clean. And a lot of what you see in Lightning now came from that Solaris design. But Solaris, as you can see a lot in enterprise design, got toned down to be more safe. So a lot of the bright colors just became like the blue and the gray.
Yeah. Can't get too crazy now.
Yeah. But that redesign initiative was, exploring how can we modernize more of the UI, but still nod to the work that we've already done in Salesforce One. That kind of just evolved into beyond like, oh, we need to redesign things, but also like we need a system in place. And so that was a weird transition time for my team where we basically kind of split off and then rejoined, and like certain people left the team, certain people joined the team. So there was a lot of transition. But what the team ended up becoming was what was the Lightning Design System team before we had quite landed on that name, which was essentially a strong CSS architect, 2 hybrid designer developer people, and a very strong visual designer, which I thought makes up a really amazing team, because we were churning out basically what was the prototype for what would become Lightning Design System.
And that was your guys' objective on that team, was basically to say like, what is this unified design for the desktop application that is heavily inspired by Salesforce One, but is ultimately able to be sort of pervasive across most of the Salesforce ecosystem? I guess, was it ecosystem wide at that point, or was it just still thinking about a more specific app?
We knew it would need to address the broader ecosystem, but at the time we were very focused on our flagship product, which was Sales Cloud. We also, our goals at the time based on, let me backtrack a little bit. I talked to a ton of engineers and told them the vision, like this is what we want to do. And some of the responses were, well, why don't we just use Bootstrap? Or, this sounds great, but it's going to be like 2 years out before we even adopt just the button. So when we were hearing things like that, we were like, okay, well, let's just do this. We'll just go ahead and work on it for us so that we can move forward with our prototypes and our style guide. And then there's the third-party ecosystem. We can provide these resources for them because they want their apps to live and look like they live in Salesforce because they look and feel like Salesforce. And then at some point, we'll address the production engineers for the actual product. So that's what we thought was going to happen. until, that whole show don't tell thing people always say, like you
Yeah,
tell
yep.
something to somebody, they're like, maybe I don't quite see it. But once you actually show them, then they want it.
Hmm.
So we had the prototype out, which was, I just did a very plain, simple version of the website that you see now for the Lightning Design System with the components and the documentation and all that. People saw it and they started copying and pasting our code to put it in the product. And we were like, wait, hold on. This is not what we intended. So we had to flip that around and now like go all in on supporting the production team. So it was like a mixture of planning as well as just like a happy accident, and that it got more successful quicker than we thought it would.
It's just like I see you as like with like a Bob Ross wig on, like making this like happy little accident that just happens to become this really powerful design system.
I had a funny metaphor I used to use too, which might sound negative, but it's not really meant to be negative. But the way I like to refer to it is like if you watch Game of Thrones, and this shouldn't be a spoiler. People know there are dragons in Game of Thrones, but Khaleesi starts off with these little eggs, and everybody's kind of excited about the eggs because they're just like, wait, that's new. Like, where did these eggs come from? And then at some point they hatch into the little dragons and everybody's like, oh, wow, cool. She's got dragons. And then they grow up into these really massive things that just start burning everything down. So I used to joke around about how like we had accidentally built a dragon that just blew up really fast and really quick. And we needed to find a way to rein it in.
And so like, how did you guys even tackle that problem? Because I can imagine we spent a fair amount of time like gently ribbing both sides of the ecosystem, maybe a little bit more disproportionately on design. So like, let me poke fun at developers real quick. Like one of the things that is always kind of fascinated about developers is like, nothing is ever going to work if you talk to them about it. And then, if you get them to estimate like, how much work they can get done inside of a sprint or something like that, and it's always like 3 times higher than what they can actually get done. And so it's always this funny like push-pull between optimism and pessimism there. And when you give a developer something that becomes like the path of least resistance for them, it's like ambrosia, right? They can't get enough of it. And so I could totally imagine this ecosystem just taking off like wildfire across like a system that is thousands of developers. And so what did those inflection points look like, and how did you manage your way through them?
So we definitely had to grow our team big time. I think at one time, I'm trying to remember what the largest number was at one time, and we also became a team of teams where we had like some people focus on the distribution and tooling and automation. Some people focus on writing the components. Some people focus on the design of it. Like we had to kind of like assemble multiple teams together because the need just grew much faster than we expected.
Yeah, the Voltron approach to design systems.
Yeah, and like the coolest thing I thought was when we brought the accessibility team under our umbrella, because it used to be a checkpoint at the end, and then that was always stressful because it's like if you didn't make it right before we shipped, then you had to wait until the next release. Where now, because they were on the design system team, things got to go in much quicker. And so having a more well-rounded range of skills and expertise was really valuable for us. Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that we realized, and this was about the time that Nathan Curtis started pushing the idea of design systems being a product. And, some people would say it's more like a service, but regardless if you think it's a product or service, both of those require customer service. And we realized that that was a huge part of what we needed to do. And so we did advisory boards. Initially, we did office hours, and then we evolved that to advisory boards. And the reason that we did that was if I'm just doing a one-on-one with you, there's other people on my team that don't know what we discussed. And so if we do it more as an advisory board thing, then we're all in the room and we all know what we discuss. And it's just a little bit better for the team as well as for the organization. And we would track who was coming to the advisory boards, what topics we were discussing, and it could be anything from like talking with the PM and the designer on what's possible, or at legal even, or following our policies, and that could be around accessibility or safety and trust and like all that stuff. Or it could be an engineer just needs some CSS help. So
Totally.
yeah, and I think that was like a really huge thing that helped us out. And we also had a standards review that we did closer to launch time of like double checking that everything is up to snuff. And and sometimes you would see people show something you've never seen before, and you're like, how come you haven't been coming to the advisory boards? This is new.
Totally. You have something to contribute. It's interesting. It reminds me a lot of thinking about some of the open source communities I've been a part of, right? Where you have things like user groups and working groups and collections of people that are topically focused, but also intending to try to make this broad impact across these systems. I was at one point really involved in the Drupal community, and you kind of talking about what you did there reminds me a lot of the types of organizations we used to try to set up within large enterprise that was adopting, a new CMS platform. Was how you create this community understanding of what this means to everybody, and how you sort of surface those contributions and get them into the core product. Like, that's a really cool way of thinking about how this scales inside of an organization from a very human perspective. Would you say that's where you maybe got your passion for some of this community stuff you're working on now?
I think I always had a passion for the community anyway, but it probably contributed to it because, prior to going all in on design systems community stuff, I was a big part of the SaaS community, and I'm still on the SaaS core team. And I think a lot of people that were doing SaaS for their CSS were already kind of design systems minded, which most of the people had the same goals, like wanting consistency and easy maintainability of code and like all that stuff. And so a lot of the desires are the same.
Right, totally.
So I feel like I just kind of like realized that it's not just the CSS part, but it's like all these other parts that I've been working on all these years. I like all of this. But that is, I'm glad you bring this up, because that is something I like to tell people is that, if you're starting a design systems effort in your organization, you are building a community, and there's a lot that comes with that, around communication and language and standards, but also like empathy and understanding and collaboration. Like, there's just so much there.
Absolutely. And I think that even when we say design systems are a product, that's still sometimes a challenge conversation inside of organizations, right? And so, that's like the starting point, right? I feel like once people have an understanding of that, then you start to bring up this idea of like, okay, and so for this product to be successful and for this product to be widely adopted, you have to evangelize it, you have to do research, you have to understand who your real consumers are, and you have to treat it almost like this tiny startup organization inside of your bigger enterprise where, your goal and your objective is to bring people on board, because nobody is going to be forced to use your system. Like, that's not a likely outcome. I mean, sometimes that happens, but it's, I would say, exceedingly rare. In which case, it's all about building this following, and really, like you said, having a lot of empathy for people and having a lot of understanding as users of your product that may not be the way that the company traditionally thinks about users. You have a lot of work to do around understanding their needs and making sure you're building the right thing for them.
This is a big reason why I don't like using the word governance in the context of design systems, because I think it does kind of like give this perception of this, like, I have to use your system because you told me to. What I prefer to see is this more like sharing approach where everybody's a shared owner, everybody, has contributed in some way to it, and are all champions of the system, even though you might be a full-time maintainer on it and the person you're working with might just be mostly a consumer of it. You still want to like give them a voice and give them the empowerment to like have a say in what goes in that system, and then you all become like shared owners of it, because really at the end of the day, we're building the same product for the same people that are using it. Yeah,
and I tend to be really, not surprising given kind of some of my background stuff, but I tend to be really like all about the contribution side of it too, right? The product teams that end up consuming that design system and then ultimately, are putting that end product in front of users, like they're the ones that are closest to that end-to-end goal, right? Like, design systems always operate at this meta level, which I think is challenging because, you almost have like two sets of users. You have your people that are consuming your design system, and then you have like the people that experience like ultimately serves, which is, maybe another business, maybe, just a normal person walking down the street. And so thinking about how you still build those experiences for that lowest, or like, I guess, last user in that chain, while still considering everybody in the interim, is I think a product challenge that doesn't exist in very many places. And having that contribution from those product teams that are ultimately consuming your design system matters, because they're the ones that are closest to those like last users in that chain.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're familiar with Nathan Curtis's concept of team models, where he talks about the centralized team and the federated contributors, and he kind of talks about them as two separate models. And he also talks about a solitary model, but at Salesforce, we were kind of a merging of that federated contributors and a centralized team. And I think if you have the scale to be able to have both, like in my eyes, that's an ideal situation, because you have I almost saw our team as more of like where we were facilitating and almost like librarians of it in a way. But the people that are working on the product, they're the ones that, like you said, like are closer to the users. Like they know more of the problem space a little bit better. I mean, you should know it too as a systems designer, but they're going to be closer to it. And so you want them to be a contributor and to be a part of it.
Yeah, they're going to understand all that nuance. And at a meta level, especially designing for not just one product, but dozens or hundreds or maybe even thousands of products, like you can't be close to every user. Like it's sort of an intractable problem. That second ripple in the design system is very hard to see, and you should be aware that it exists and you should know that it's there. But really seeing over that first ripple is really challenging, just because of a function of scale. And it's interesting too, because I think that this is where a lot of fragmentation begins to exist, right? Because if all of a sudden, product team XYZ is not really feeling like what they're getting from the design system is serving their user base, they're not apt to use it, or they're apt to create their own. Did you guys ever face that at Salesforce, where you had like, lightning and then like thunder or clap that were like, competing design systems that existed inside of the organization?
So I think this has happened at almost everywhere I've been, but lightning was getting a lot of traction, so that we were able to move beyond just focusing on our flagship product, but now scale it to our other products. And for the most part, that went pretty seamlessly, because the design organization was almost as its own unit and then scaled across all these different products. But then, we had a ton of like acquisitions that were kind of newer to the organization, and some of those companies already had a way of doing things. And there was one team in particular that was building their own system, that they would have their own third-party ecosystem of customers and other implementation builders use. So what they had done was basically forked Lightning and then reskinned it, and they, whatever name that they were using before, which I forget right now, they just called it that design system. And we were like, hold on, no, it doesn't. It's like, it doesn't really work that way. And obviously, but we recognized we didn't want to just shut them out, but we recognized they had a lot of time and energy, and we were like, these are clearly contributors that need to be a part of what we're doing. And so rather than just saying, no, you can't do this, and shutting them down, we were like, look, you're building a React library and a Angular library and I forget all the other implementations they were building, which is stuff that we haven't been able to focus on because we're focusing on the core agnostic part of it. So help us build those implementations so that, we can make it more official. Like it's all part of the same effort. And that was a much better approach for sure.
No, absolutely. And I think it's interesting too, because you were talking about Bootstrap a little bit earlier, right? Like I've had so many people just say back to me, so is this like your own custom Bootstrap? And the answer is like, yeah, kind of, in a way. You can think about it like that. But, that implies that you're taking this design system and then you're kind of building your own fork of it that is used in your own individual product. And I try to caution people that, that's not really what this is about. Like, sure, you can do that, and that is an approach, but it's not one of those ones that is really contributing back to this broader, concept that can be reused over and over again across products. We have this tendency to talk about design systems as being really valuable to a product, but I've always thought about the value of a design system really being like, how you share things between products, because traditionally so much of innovation has been locked in these stovepipes of product teams, right? Product team A, product team B, product team C. Product team C does something really innovative. It's very hard for that innovation to flow back into A and B. And so design systems are kind of this enabling force for taking all this innovation that happens at this product level and then sharing it across this broader product ecosystem. And to me, that's the true like essence of the value of a design system. It's not the component library, it's not the documentation. To some degree, it's like the cross-functional collaboration. But what all of that is enabling is this sharing of innovation between products.
I was a big fan of the talk I saw recently at Design Systems London by the folks at Spotify. Because, they're not just dealing with the Spotify app that you would see on your phone or on your desktop app, but like cars or, there's other
Your
things.
wristwatch.
And those are not going to be using the same component library, obviously. And so rather than thinking of it as like, one library to rule them all, it was more like, well, here's the Spotify design language. I think they called it Encore. And how that could then become a system of systems that have their own way of doing things. And I mean, it was just kind of the same thing, but a little different at Amazon. Amazon has like 20 design systems. And when I tell people that, they're like, why? That doesn't make any sense. I'm like, well, actually it does. Why would the person that's standing in a factory scanning a box that's about to get shipped out to a customer use the same UI on that little device as somebody using Twitch, or the person shopping on Amazon.com or, or using Amazon Video. Like these are all very, very different products.
I completely see your point, right? This idea that is thinking about even like beyond screens, right? Like what does a design system for Alexa look like? And I think that's where like this conversation starts to get really crazy and really interesting, right? Is if we're talking about this just creation of this systematic approach, you start to take maybe even one more meta level attached to your already kind of meta design systems concept is this idea of a philosophy, very much like how, Agile is this philosophy that permeates our software development life cycles, thinking about design systems permeating this collaboration process that is attached to that software development cycle. It's an interesting thing to think about. And I've pulled on this thread a handful of times, but I've never really had like the conversation about it. Is design systems a practical implementation, or is it this philosophy that then has all of these different ways of implementing this philosophy based on a more product-centric approach?
I love that you said that, because that's been sort of a slightly controversial thing I've been talking about recently is design systems are not a thing. And I know some people will be like, wait, what? Why would you say that? But it's really, in my eyes, more of a methodology or a process or like even a way of thinking about, shipping products. And, a lot of times people say, oh, I built a design system. And it's like, what does that really mean? Yeah.
No, you probably already had a design system, but it maybe just wasn't like, as clearly implemented as you have it now or something. I don't know. It's still difficult to describe. And there's a lot of like kind of nascent thinking that I really want to dive more deeply into on this topic, because I think that much like it was very difficult to describe like what is Agile a decade ago, what is a design system is I think equally entering that sort of zeitgeist of our community right now, because there are so many different ways of defining it. And you look at graphs of Venn diagrams and bubbles and all this other stuff like that all are making this attempt to describe this really complex thing. And I've definitely settled on the idea of and it sounds like you have too, and that's awesome, by the way, that there's like this broader concept at play here. And we're all just talking about ways of implementing that broader way of thinking.
Right. Like there's obviously the way we move forward in the future, but I even think to the past, like design systems for NASA, they weren't building CSS components back then.
Right.
And so they're always going to, the form that they take are always going to change and evolve. I mean, I think web is going to be around a long time, so that's always going to be a thing that we talk about and think about. But it's really this broader way of thinking and approaching building experiences for our users.
Yeah, very well said. So I know you've also been working on this design token community group, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that, because I think that this is a really interesting sort of new focus that has gained this, following through a lot of the work you've done and now leading this community. I want to hear a little bit more about what you're doing there.
Yeah, so design tokens definitely are kind of the new hotness right now, it seems, that everybody's trying to figure out. And there's a lot of amazing design tools that are starting to implement them, which I think is fantastic. I think the problem is that, I think a lot of people are a little confused about, well, what is the right way to implement this into my tool? And is there a standard approach that we could do this? Is there an API? And everybody's just kind of mostly followed what Salesforce did, or are trying to implement their own way of doing things. But it just seemed like it made sense, if we're really going to be doing this in our design systems, to have some sort of standards around this. And when I talk about standards, I don't mean picking what the values for your tokens will be, or even picking what the names of your tokens will be, because those are very opinionated things that are always going to change depending on your organization. But it's really more on if you're trying to get Figma to talk to XML, or you're trying to get Envision's DSM to talk to this, or you're trying to get Adobe, all these different products that are out there. Is there a way we can standardize that so that people aren't walled into systems and they can change and move to different tools and things continue to work as they should?
Right. So you're looking at an unopinionated structure of an implementation, and a lot less of an actual opinionated implementation. So it's all about how do I define the structure of what a design token should look like, rather than what the token is itself. And
then so there was kind of already people interested in this, James Nash kind of did his own take on what he thought would be design token standards, and some other people have kind of expressed interest in it. So then Kalig, who I worked with at Salesforce, and he contributed to Theo as well, he decided, to just go ahead and make it a thing. Let's make this official. And so he signed up for it to be a W3C community group, which is different from a working group, because it's, anybody can start a community group as long as it's around doing having clear goals on standardizing an implementation of something that's going to be in the interests of the W3C. And design tokens aren't purely web related, so he was even unsure if it would count, but apparently it does, because it still is impactful for the web. So he and I are the chairs, and we've been going through rounds of interviews with people to figure out who will be the editors, because there's kind of different modules. There's the overall global format, but then there's the modules that break down into color or spacing or motion guidelines, things like that. And I will admit, I am not strong on API writing or anything like that. So my particular role on this is really interested in more of the community side of things, as well as creating it not to just be the standards documentation, but also a resource. Because I get asked so many times by people, where do I even start? How do I talk about this to my boss and explain what it is? How do I put this into my product? And people have written Medium articles and done talks, but there's not really a go-to place to find out even where do I even get started. And so that's going to be my contribution to the community group. Not necessarily say I'm going to create everything, because it's a lot of work, but there's a bunch of people that have already volunteered to help. And so just kind of pushing that forward and making it a really valuable resource, so people know what the heck these things even are and how do you put it in your product and all that.
No, and we'll put a link to the working group in the show notes so that people can check it out. And then of course there's your other big project that's just this little side gig called Clarity. I know that things are crazy with pandemic and all this other stuff like that. So I know you guys are doing the conference virtually this year. How has that evolved and changed? Not just relative to the pandemic, but as this community has gained steam, what's some exciting new stuff that's happening there?
This is now year 5, which still blows my mind. I think I only had ever intended to do 1 or 2. And
conferences is a way of doing that. They end up being these things that are a little bit addictive.
Yeah. And it's just been growing every year. Like it started around like 296 or something like that. And now, last year it was like 700 people. So just seeing like the hunger for this knowledge that people have, as well as just being in the room with all these other people that are doing what you're doing. And it's just really exciting. And I get a lot of energy from the room, just seeing everybody engaging and learning. And of course there's the talks, but just being in that room with people is amazing. So this year's going to be interesting with the new approach that we have to take. What I'm excited about is it means there's no borders to who can come, and there's no requirement to travel. So I'm hoping this means it will have a much more diverse range of people attending. But I admit, as a community person, I'm a little bummed that there won't be people to just grab and hug.
I totally hear you. I go to a fair number of conferences every year, and I've definitely been missing that contact of like seeing those people that you know and love and care about in person. Like there is no way of really creating that in a virtual conference environment yet.
One thing I'm really excited about, which I guess this is kind of giving you a little sneak peek early, but I feel okay doing that. We don't want to just be a stream of talks because, I've been sitting on a lot of online conferences recently, and not to bash any of them, like they've all been pretty good for the most part, like maybe some little minor mishaps, but it's kind of demanding of people to have them sit like at their computer for like hours for multiple days. And so we were like, how can we make this more engaging? And so it's almost like a TV production is the way we're thinking about it. Like, what happens between the talks? What content do we serve then? And then, are there things that are a bit more interactive? And so we're kind of thinking of it as more of a production rather than a conference right now.
That's awesome. I'm excited to see what it looks like, and Clarity interdimensional cable sounds amazing. So I for one am very much looking forward to it. I can't wait to see what it's all about this year. Well, hey, Jina, I just want to say thank you so much for being on today. Also, thank you for all the work you do in supporting this community. It's much appreciated. I know that you've made a big impact on us and the way that we think about design systems. And I just want to say, like, keep on being awesome.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
That's all for today. We'd love to hear from you with questions, ideas for new episodes, beer recommendations, or comments. You can find us on Twitter @TheDSPod. Cheers, and thanks for listening to the Design Systems Podcast.